So in this quick video, I want to show how to create uh, apps, service principals, and auth permission entries that are described inside of this Azure AD Graph API document. Azure AD Graph API is a little older API, um, but it is still used by a lot of the Azure management SDKs, such as Java SDK. So that's why I'll just focus on this API in this description. And what is important to understand is it is a pretty complex topic. There are books about it, and there's a great free chapter from Vittorio describing what a delegated permission means and how these permission grants look like and what they are. We'll talk about them, but if you want to understand the theory behind it, highly recommend to read this great article. So let's start. Let's go to the Azure Active Directory, create an application first. So an application will be for our application to use. We'll use it to get the tokens. Usually you can do this programmatically via SDKs and APIs as well. I'll just do this part in a token. So this will be my root app one. And because it will have pretty high level of permissions to be able to actually create other users, delete them, etc. So I created a root app at this point. What I will do next is I will tell that this app needs some certain level of permissions. I want this application itself without any user to be able to read and write directory data and read and write applications. And sign in on behalf of the user, we don't actually even need this permission, for example. So let's save this. This means I can create users and groups, but not delete them. For that, we will do something else. So at this point, we saved it. However, once we saved it, it is only saying what the template is for this permission. So it didn't actually grant this permission to this application throughout the directory. For that to happen, we need to click this grant permissions button, and that's what will create a service principal and automatically create the auth grant permissions entries for that service principal. So later we'll see how to do it programmatically by calling the APIs directly. So I'll click the grant permissions button, and it right now granted consent to this, so I can start using it programmatically. Now I need to add a secret key. I'm not going to keep it secret because I will delete it after this video is recorded. Save it. And there we go with the key. So I'm going to put it in my little notepad here. This is going to be my key, and this is going to be my client ID. So this is the client ID. Okay. And then let's go, and now this application can do certain things already. So let's open Postman. So Postman is an app I installed in my Chrome browser. Go in apps and click Postman. And I recorded all of the different calls that I'm going to be making. So it's much easier to show them instead of typing them live. And I put them over here under Azure Active Directory. So first thing we'll do is we'll get a token. And to get a token, we'll do a post to the tenant with the client ID and secret. Right now, these are pointing to wrong values. So we should get a failure because I did not update. I just created the application, right? So notice it tells me that the application doesn't exist, etc. Where are these values coming from? They're coming from an environment that I define inside of Postman. It's very convenient for this purpose. So there's my uh, client ID. So for client ID, we have this application ID. And for client secret, we have what we copied before. Okay, so let's do a quick test of what we have. Tenant ID represents my Azure Active Directory update. Okay, and then I will send, and these values will now come in from that environment in Postman, which I defined right there. Send, boom, I got my access token properly for accessing Graph API. That's what I said. I want to access Graph API. And what I did is I grabbed that access token from the JSON body of this response, and I just stored it in the access token environment variable. So in every other call, I can do it without typing it in, right? So let's get groups. So you can see bearer token is the access token, and it shows me the groups I have in my Azure AD. Let's create a group. So this is a call to the Graph API, groups, API version, etc. All of this is documented in a Graph API documentation on this page. What calls are meant for what. It's a little, documentation is quite long, so you need to see it before trying it. create a group. Let's create a group. How do I create a group? Again, I have a header with a token, and in the body, I have the definition of my group, and I call it group one. Let's say my group one, because I think I do have a group one already. So let's say my group one, send. So it created for me a group. How do I know it worked? Let's look in the UI. So in the UI, under users and groups, we should now see my group one right there, right? No, nobody's inside of that group, but that group exists. Let's try to delete the group, right? So I should have permissions supposedly to delete group because I gave myself a read and delete permission. So I take the object ID of this group and I go to my delete group call. I put the ID of the group here. The reason I don't have authenticate again, just because the access token is being reused. And I will say send a delete request, right? And you see what it's telling me, insufficient privileges to complete the operation. This happens because the account that I have, even though it's marked with permissions to read and write directory, deletion of users and groups is a special level of permission. It's not part of those permissions. So for that, I need to use PowerShell. I logged in as my real account first, the admin account. I'm going to find my app by using find my service principal of the app right here. And I'm going to take the object ID of the service principal representing the incarnation of the app in my Active Directory, and I'm going to make it a user account administrator. So I'm going to get the role of that, and I'm going to marry them together through this call, Azure AD directory role member, making this user, the service principal, be able to perform actions that are more administrative like that. I still will not be able to do it for a little bit of time because the permissions are cached. Let's just double check. What if we reissue our token and try again? Yeah, it may take a little bit of time, so that is why the deletion doesn't work. So we'll just continue for now, and we'll look at it later. So that's why the deletion didn't work, because my user was not in the right role. But we'll continue. So the next important part, how do I create a native app programmatically, right? So I can create a native app right here in the portal. And when I create an app in the portal, it actually does two things as described in this document. It creates the app, creates the service principal at the same time. What I will do is I will create the app in two steps using the low-level REST calls, because some SDKs do not provide a way to create what's called a native app. So what's special about native app is that it does not have a concept of a client secret, because it's a public client that there is no secret with it. So in Azure, CLI, for example, is a client app that is a multi-tenant app that gets added to an Active Directory, but it doesn't really have a secret because the secret cannot be stored locally on the device. So we'll not use this interface. Rather, we'll go to Postman and do it there. So let's see. Let's get the apps and see what we have. So right now we have my previous Packer app and the root app that I created. Let's create a native app. To create a native app, I have again my tokens, but now I have a body here. And this body is very important. What it's saying is it's creating my native app. That's the name of the app that will be displayed. And most important part is making it native is this, public client is true. That's what makes it a native app. And what is defined over here are the permissions that this app should have. And there are three sections here. One is for Azure Active Directory. One is for Azure Management Service, and one is for Azure Data Lake Store, because I need the native app basically to access the Azure Data Lake Store. Let's say that is my use case. I want to use this native app together with delegation of the user to access it. So these define them. How do I know what IDs to use here? Well, I created one first via the portal one time, and then I went in and I assigned the required permissions properly in the portal like this to the applications I need, and then click manifest. And when you click manifest, you can exactly see these values, because these are well-known IDs. In particular, the ones at this level are well-known IDs. The ones lower here, they're not. So we'll discuss them. So let's see what happens. So I will press this button, and it's right now making the call to create the app. So the call took a little while, but it did get created. Usually it's very fast. And you can see now I have an app ID and an object ID. Let's see in the portal what we see. So we should see the app now in the portal as well. So you can see the app in the portal right there, my native app, and you can see the application ID and the object ID. And what we will do is we will double check that there is no service principal created for this app yet. So let's take this application ID, because usually if I do it in a portal, it automatically creates both. However, when I do it through an API, it's very fine-grained. So I actually just created the app, but not the service principal. How can we double check? Let's go to the service principals and search by the app ID. This is a filter that I'm putting on the OData that the API supports, and I'm putting the app ID here, and I should get back a response that has nothing. Okay, so now to be able to assign permissions to this app, if I go here and start assigning, you see it shows those three items that I had defined with these delegate permissions. If I click this button, if I click this magical button, it will create a service principal and it will automatically add the right OAuth2PermissionGrant entries for all users in the directory. So there is no reason to grant, so there's no need for each user to grant permissions to themselves. However, we want to see how can we do it programmatically without pressing this button. So for that, it's a little more tricky. It requires multiple steps. So ideally, just use this button. But if you need to do it and understand how it works behind the scenes, let's see. So no service principal yet. Let's create the service principal. So to create a service principal, we will copy the app ID right here. This is kind of the minimalistic structure of what a service principal is. We will put the app name right here. It has to match identically. Let me show you what will happen if I don't. So I will put the wrong one here. And it says it doesn't match it, right? So I will put the right one here. So now it creates a service principal. A service principal is an incarnation of the app within my ID tenant. So it just created my service principal, right? And now let's get the service principals back. And you can see there is a service principal for my app. It has the app ID, but more importantly, it has this object ID. And this object ID is the ID of my service principal. Service principal object ID for my native app, okay? So this is actually the object ID. So this is not the client ID. So client ID will be this, the app ID. But this is the object ID, and I need this object ID in order to do this grant, okay? In order to do this grant. So how do I know what I need to provide for this grant? So there is a way to do it. I can press this button, and then I can let it do this magical stuff. And then I can go back and I can get those grants out from the database. So see, this is the client ID here. So let's paste here the current object ID of my service principal. I should not see anything yet because I never granted it any permissions, correct? Great. But what about other application that I have? Let's see, the other service principals that I may have already in the system, I will have their permissions here. So now we want to make sure that when we call this, we get back 3 permissions. And the 3 permissions need to be for the service principal ID, this one, of my app. Okay, this service principal ID, tying it to the 3 permissions that we wanted the app to have. So what does it mean? So let me show you what it means. So for Azure AD, I need the client ID of my permission to be the service principal of my app that I created. I want to say the consent type is all principals. How do I know? Well, it documented right here. All principals, meaning every user, not for each user individually need to accept the permissions, but for all users it's granted. Principal ID is null because it's all principals. I'll put in long start and end expiry times just as an example. And then for resource ID, this is the tricky part. These values are service principal IDs representing the application that corresponds to this resource, right? So you see, these had the resource of the app. So these are well-known app IDs. You see, this one is a well-known app, which is the Azure Active Directory. So how do I get its service principal ID? Well, I can just search for it in my service principal, in my Active Directory, and you can see the app ID is right here, and the service principal 54, etc. is right here, and that is the value that I put here. This one is the Azure Data Lake Store app, and for that I need to use scope user impersonation. Okay, and then I have the same one for ARM. So let's just double check again. How do I know? I am going here and I'm looking up this app, well-known app. I'm looking it up inside of the service principals database right here. So let's see if we get the corresponding thing. I just prepared it before. So you can see 3.7 and you can see 3.7. Okay. So now I can create my 3 consents, hopefully programmatically. So what I'm going to do is going to go to create auth permission grant, which posts to this, the 2 headers and the body. And in the body, I will copy and paste those snippets one by one, right? So that's first call. And if I do it again, you can see that it's already there. Then I will do my second call. And this is, again, all gets done automatically when you press that button in the portal. I need to replace this client ID right here with my new one because it was from previous example. So it said client ID was not found, that's why. So that's the client ID, again, service principal of my app. And final example is the third permission. Okay. So let's see what we have. So now we have all 3 permissions granted to this app. It is equivalent, hopefully, we'll double check, to clicking this button. Okay, I just did the same thing. You cannot visually see it in the portal in any place. However, you can do this experimentation by going back here and seeing show me, and you can see that those permissions are granted, all principals to my client corresponding to those apps. You can also do it via PowerShell commandlets that exist under PowerShell. I don't have them right here, but get command name auth, and you can see the command would be get OAuth permission grant. So let me just show you the same command that calls the same API basically that I just showed you, right? And it's showing you which permissions are assigned to which resource. I did the same thing on a low level through the API. So at this point, we have granted, hopefully, the permissions to the app. Next step will be to actually try to use this app and authenticate as a user against this app and see if we are able to uh, access Azure Data Lake Store or get a token from this app that we created programmatically. Give me a second and I'll be back with that. Okay, so now let's confirm that this native app is actually useful for us. So we created the native app, we have its application ID, and hopefully the required permissions were granted to it. Now let's see if we can use it to get a token for a real user in the Azure directory here, just passing this application, and we can use that token to browse Azure Data Lake Store. So let's see what we're going to do. We're going to take this application ID and copy it in right into the get token parameter. So what I did is I'm pasting here the endpoint to which I'm going to make the request. The key is this client ID is that native application that I created. The password and the username are not shown, but irrelevant. They're just a user within that application with a grant type password. And I want it for the management endpoint because that's how I access Azure Data Lake Store as well. So if I say send, right now, you can see it's successfully coming back to me with this access token, which I again will reset after this video is recorded. And if I copy this access token and I make a request to my data lake store, so let's say that is my data lake store and I want to browse folder add, okay? If I just make a request with a regular bearer empty, you can see that there is no token, it doesn't work. I will paste the token here and I'll resubmit the request, and you can see it's successfully returning to me the data within that folder. If I try to browse a folder that's one level higher, it will not work because that user only has access to the folder in question, okay? And that confirms, what does it confirm? It confirms that this client ID of the application we defined, and we defined it and we gave it permissions, is actually working. Let's do a negative example of creating an app and not granting it permissions and seeing if it will still work, okay? Let's try that example in a second. So let's create that application not through the UI again, but through the same API calls, give it a different name, create a service principal, and not assign the auth permissions grant and see if it works, okay? So here what we're going to do. We're going to go to the create a native application. Let's give it a name to, okay? Same permission requested, but we are not going to actually grant those permissions. So access token missing or malformed. Apologize for that. Let's re-authenticate, okay? And let's do create native application. Okay, so we got the native application created now. That's our app ID. Let's now create a service principal for that app ID. So we need to put the service principal, the app ID right in these two slots. And if we don't change the name, you'll see it will not be happy. It must match it. So that's the service principal of the app, okay? And we did not give it, right? So let's grab the service principal and confirm, this is the service principal ID, and confirm that the grants were not performed by looking right here, right? We are searching for that service principal and we see nothing. In the UI, on the other hand, it's a little bit more confusing because what we will see is we have the app and it will seem to have the required permissions. However, this button was never pressed and the API was never called to make that happen. So now let's see. Let's grab this application ID, okay? And let's try to log in as the user, but using this application ID, okay? And see what happens. Perfect. And you can see exactly the problem we're trying to solve. The user or administrator has not consented to the application with this ID. Send an interactive authorization for this user or grant the permissions. Because we did this now, it may be a slow process. There's some caching involved to actually clear up this issue. But let's give it a shot real quick via what an interactive login would be like. So in this case, we did not provide a pre-authorization. So what I have here is basically a URL that we will try. This URL is constructed by just taking the tenant ID and saying I want to authorize. And this is that application ID that we never granted permissions to, right? Let's just see if we interactively, for a user in question, we can get it authenticated properly. So what I will do is grab this URL, open an incognito window, okay? And it will ask me to log in. You see, it shows me the name of my app. And if a user does it one time manually, so let me type the username and password. So I'm going to type the password now and we'll sign in and see what happens. Obviously, it shouldn't redirect me to any valuable place because the redirect URL is wrong, but hopefully this should create the consent in the next step. It needs permission to Azure Data Lake Service and Service Management API, and you're saying that is this user. Is this okay? and it shows me where and what, and I will say yes, and now it will redirect me to nowhere land, which is fine. It gave me the code, but this interactive authentication hopefully performed exactly what we wanted and made it possible for us to query this. So let's get a quick token reauthentication here and then get the permissions again. And you can see that it actually granted to this application the permissions. But notice how interesting it is that inside of this grant, the consent type is principal, and the application is the application service principal. And then what is this principal is my user. So just for this user, it was granted. Any other user will also not be able to use it. So at this point, though, if I go to the token and password login flow, it will work because this user already got authenticated and I'm able to actually query using this token the information. But every other user will be flowing through the same required authentication flow. So they could be simply a way to have the user authenticate once to perform this grant, or I could do the grant on behalf of the user programmatically in the portal by using this button that will grant it for everybody. Or also let's do again our example of granting it right here. So we could grant it using making calls to add these records in, and the only thing we need to change is for my Active Directory, these IDs stay the same, but this ID is the client ID of the application service principal. So let's see what that is and just double check it. So get auth permissions, and you can see it's always the same 31777 3C1, and then see if I replace this with it and this with it and this with it. If I do this programmatically now, I'm able to have all the other users not have to do this manually. Access token missing on my form because every time obviously I log in, it's recreating it. So there we go. So added that permission, a DLS permission, and finally ARM permission. So this way, as an admin, I granted these programmatically to all other users, so they do not have to anymore flow through that approach that I showed using this URL, okay, because it's already granted for every user. And the way to confirm it is if I log in myself again through this URL. In this window, I'm already logged in, so that's not even interesting. But if I have a new window and I log in, it will not prompt me for consent anymore. And we can confirm that the consent is there by searching and seeing that, yes, we have explicit permission for this principal, but we also have the all principals permission granted. So that's a way to grant the permissions. Just to recap the steps again, what you have to do to make this to simulate this button. You have to create an app. So let's just create an app programmatically. Once you create an app programmatically, so let's say create a native app, you get an app ID and an object ID. Then what you need to do is taking the app ID, you need to create a service principal. So make this call, create a service principal. You get the object ID of the service principal, and that is what you will need to post when creating the permissions. Okay, so in a little file for yourself, you would put that principal service principal object ID inside of these sections. Now you also need this resource ID. What are you granting permissions to? How do you do this? So here is a quick and easy way to do it. I promised to show it, so let me show it at the very end. Let's say create an application right here. So we will do test app in UI 1. We'll make it a native app, localhost, just for fun. Okay, so we create a native app. We're gonna do it all in the portal now. right? So test UI app, I go here and I say required permissions. And then I will add myself the permission that I need. So I need to add permission for Azure Data Lake, okay? And let me also add a permission and then the scope, okay? There we go. So that's a permission for Data Lake. And let's also add a permission for Service Management API. There we go. Okay, and we will save it. So now I have these three permissions. It's all great. So what is good about this is that now I have the application, right? So how do we know? Let's see. The application will be here. And so I like to see it all in a low-level REST calls just to confirm that my thinking is correct. So let's see my native app. I'm just looking through the list. There it is, test UI app. So my app ID is this. Let's see, is the service principal there? Well, it for sure is there by now because we added those permissions and the UI automatically creates a service principal. So let's see the service principal. And you can see the service principal is there as well. Are the permissions there? Okay, so this is the service principal. Let's grab this ID and see, are the grants there? Do you think there are there or not? They're not. They're not there. Even though which is what we expect, even though we said we want these permissions, we never pressed this button. So the whole point of what I'm showing now is how to get the idea of what IDs to use for that button. So I say grant permissions, and now they are there. And if we go back to Postman and ask for them, we see them here. So this confirms what the exercise we did automatically. And you can see these are the resource IDs. And just to recap finally on what these are, you can see they're matching identically to the same ones I had before. They are going to be different for you. Keep this in mind. These are going to be different for you. What you do to find them, just once more, is you take the resource app ID that defines the permissions that you require for the app. These are the three apps. And you look up the service principal ID in your Active Directory for these. So if I put this app ID right here for the native app, right? That is global. That's for everybody the same. And I look up a service principal within my directory and you do it within yours, you will see the service principal ID 5F44, and notice this is 5F44. So you fill this out by first finding them in your Active Directory. And that is how you do manually what this button does automatically. Okay, it's a little more easy to do it automatically. And then let's just clean up. You can see that sometimes the portal doesn't let you delete native apps. I noticed this, but it's okay. So let's just delete the apps we created. So it's one app cleaned up, another app cleaned up. My root app will clean up in a second. Before cleaning up the root app, let's clean up this test UI app that's not deletable. So I'll just grab its object ID, go to my Postman methods, and I will delete it from here. And I think it will tell me token is wrong. Oh no, it did, because I was expecting it to be logged in as a user, but let's see. So now those apps are all cleaned up, and now I can delete my root app. That's the one through which all of these tokens were issued. So before deleting it, let's just see, did the timeout expire on deleting a resource group? Just for a second. Let's see, get groups. And we got the groups. Let's see if we can delete the group already or not yet. Timeout, I'm not sure the length of timeout. So it's always good to set up your permissions before even trying one time. Okay, it looks like the timeout is good now because I was able to delete the group without a problem. You know, right there. So now let's delete the application. And once the application is deleted, we don't have the application anymore. So our login logic should stop working very soon. It may Still take a few seconds, but then now it stopped working. And because it stopped working, we should not be able to get too many other calls anymore. That concludes this example. Hopefully it was useful. And you can see the cleanup actually removed most of these objects from the Active Directory, the ones that had to do with my specific permissions. So the apps that I deleted, they disappeared from this list. Thank you very much. Have a good day.